Hi, Rebecca.
Hello.
How are you?
I'm good, thank you. How are you?
Good, thanks. Good, thanks. So we were going to talk about the paper. So do you want to
Yeah,
start?
yeah. So we've written a practitioner review for the Journal of Child Psychology and Psychiatry, looking at some of the strengths and limitations of ACE scores or Adverse Childhood Experience scores. So just to give a bit of intro about what ACE scores are, they're just simply a number of adversities that somebody has reported experiencing. So adversities being things like child maltreatment, parental separation or divorce, sometimes death of a parent, for instance, and it's literally just the number of different adversities that somebody has experienced. So they've been used really widely, particularly since Vincent Felitti study in 1998 in the Causal Permanente Adverse Childhood Experiences study. And they showed in that study that people who reported more adversity, so a higher A score, had a higher risk of all sorts of different health outcomes in adulthood. So they've been really key at sort of highlighting the potential influence of early life circumstances for lifelong health. But they have lots of problems as well. So they're oversimplistic in lots of ways. They don't tell us a huge amount about the different types of adversities experienced. And they also one of the main problems, is that they assume that each type of adversity has an equal effect on, for instance, some kind of health outcome, which is really highly unlikely to be the case. I'm also not able to assess things like frequency, duration of experience, how severe that experience was, how long it went on for, who was involved in that experience as well. So there are lots of things to be mindful of when we're using ACE scores, basically.
Mm. Yeah, and I guess just to come in on that, I mean, I'm really struck as a clinician and someone who's quite involved in policy as well, that although ACE scores are oversimplistic, they are also beautifully simple. So I think the simplicity of them has actually been a real strength in helping the public and policymakers understand the importance of early adversity.
Yes, absolutely. And I think, as I mentioned, that's something that's been really key in showing, how important potentially family social circumstances are for lifelong health. And I think that's been really great to get policymakers and practitioners on board as well, to recognise that, and that's been fantastic. But I think we all agree as well that we need something that's a bit more sophisticated, but it keeps that ease of use that the ACE scores currently have, so that we can continue to push this sort of area of research forward. And one aspect of ACEs that's really key to recognise here is that adversities tend to co-occur. So there have been several studies that have shown that people who report one type of adversity are much more likely to go on to report several other types of adversities as well. And they all sorts of reflect similar experiences as well. So, somebody reporting sexual abuse, by sort of definition, that's also highlighting emotional abuse as well, as the child's sort of developmental needs, etc., haven't been met. And there are some ways that researchers are now starting to tackle these by applying statistical methods, for example, things like latent class analysis, which is a data-driven approach. It seeks to find sort of patterns or clusters in the data. So in the context of ACEs research, it tries to find individuals or groups of individuals who are reporting similar types of adversities. And then we can use that information to say, well, okay, if we find a group of people who are reporting, for instance, parents' mental health problems, along with, say, maltreatment, is that particularly highly associated with health, for instance? So we can pick out which adversities we think are most important.
And so, just to kind of be clear in my own mind, with the latent class analysis, you're kind of looking at what hangs together in terms of types of ACEs, but also potentially the types of ACEs, or the groups of ACEs that might hang together with other problems like poverty and things like that.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, exactly. And actually that leads nicely onto what is an adversity and what isn't adversity. And I think poverty is one of those things that sometimes has been considered as adversity, but conceptually I think it's slightly different as well.
No, I would agree. I mean, I think poverty is a really tricky one. And I think one of the pieces of research that's been really important is all the research about relative poverty, because I suppose for me, I think not living in poverty is better considered as just a basic human right.
Mm-hmm.
But we know that if everyone around you is living in poverty, it seems to be not as bad for your health than, you know, the situation where you're living in poverty right next to people who are actually really wealthy, and that relative poverty seems to be worse. So personally, I think poverty, you can't just include it as an ACE without being really much more sophisticated about it.
Yeah, absolutely, and it's likely to be a really strong predictor of a lot of these types of adversities as well. So I think it's, you know, there's been very recent systematic reviews in the last month or so that have really tried to highlight that as well. So I think that's really key to highlight to policymakers. Another thing that we need to be careful about, and that we've highlighted in our review, is about how we interpret ACEs research, and making sure that that's done in a really sensitive way that avoids very deterministic messages, basically, because a lot of this is from big population level studies in epidemiology and psychology. And so we're talking about average level effects. So on average, people reporting more adversities tend to have, on average, poorer health. But we should be very careful about talking about individuals in that same way.
Absolutely. And I think for me as a clinician, we now know that abused and neglected children are actually more likely to have neurodevelopmental problems, things like ADHD and autism. And so if we think that ACEs explain everything, then as clinicians, we might be tempted not to look any further. And then, of course, there are children who've had ACEs who don't want to have difficulties.
Yeah, absolutely. And we also need to be thinking about new ways in which we consider ACEs, that I mentioned at the beginning, about sort of new methods that respect this idea of clustering of adversity, that highlight that, but also that are able to take into account things like timing and duration and severity. And I think longitudinal studies in particular are going to be really key to pushing that work forward.
Mm-hmm. And I think for me, as a clinical researcher, I feel that somehow we need to find ways of getting to that greater level of sophistication while still maintaining the beautiful simplicity, because the last thing a clinician is going to want is something that's going to take them half an hour to complete.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, you know, that's a really fine balance to strike. And so we really do need some more research on that, both from the practice side, getting clinicians, etc., to help to inform that work, but also from the research side as well, I think would be really key. And Helen, you had some interesting thoughts also about policy and practice.
Well, I think that's right. I mean, living in Scotland, the whole kind of ACEs language has been around and it's become very popular. And I actually think there have been some really positive sides of that. So one of the things I notice is that our police, for example, are much more ACE aware, and it does seem to be making people more compassionate. And I notice more compassionate interactions on the streets of Glasgow, you know, police, you know, down on their hunkers, talking respectfully to homeless people. And I think that understanding that many people on the streets have had very difficult early childhoods has had a positive effect. So it's balancing those things about realising that a kind of ACE-aware policy is a good thing as long as it's not deterministic and you're not assuming people who've had adverse experiences are going to go on to have heart attacks and die soon.
Yeah, absolutely.
That's the message that you want to get, because many people who've had adverse childhood experiences really flourish and do well. And really, I think the key for the future is trying to understand that.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely.
Oh, well, it's been really interesting talking to you, Rebecca. Bye for now.
Bye.